Welcome to this final keynote debate of today. I'm Claire Fox, I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas. The original thinking behind this event, Moral Panics or Just Panic, was prompted by the whole discussion around Hackgate. I was particularly taken with an article actually that David Aaronovitch wrote, but where he talked about the kind of firestorms question, because there are times when you feel as though things just get out of control. There are things now called Twitter storms, but it is amazing when you suddenly notice that somebody says the wrong thing, the next moment there's a Twitter storm, there's demands that they resign, sacked, or what have you. You can't tell sometimes whether this is a serious issue that you need to really address and a genuine scandal that requires deep investigation, or whether it's a flash in the pan. We've seen attacks on politicians in a similar vein. We've seen attacks, as it were, on the corporate world, on bankers, banker bashing and so on, in a similar vein. Vicious sometimes deserved, I'm not saying that, but I wanted to just think about it. So I've asked 3 people to think about it. The format is that they're all going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes each. I'm going to get a bit of a discussion going on the panel, but I'm going to go out fairly quickly to the audience. I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order that they will speak. So first of all, we're going to hear from Brendan O'Neill. He's the editor of the online magazine Spiked, one of the media partners at the Battle of Ideas. Brendan is a columnist for The Big Issue in Britain and for The Australian. He actually went to Australia earlier this year and created a Twitter storm all on his own by going on the equivalent of Any Questions. He writes a daily blog for the Daily Telegraph, in spite of the fact that, according to The Guardian, he's a Marxist proletarian firebrand. He started his career in journalism at Spike's predecessor, Living Marxism, and his successor, LM magazine, which I was the publisher of. And he's the author of Can I Recycle My Granny and 39 Other Eco Dilemmas. And if you know Brendan, you'll know that he doesn't hold back on what he thinks. Next up will be Jenni Russell, who is a columnist and broadcaster of some renown. She writes for the Evening Standard. I love her columns there, The Guardian and the Sunday Times. She's a 2011 winner of the Orwell Prize for Political Journalism. I'm delighted that Jenni's here. I've wanted her to speak at the Battle of Ideas for some years, so she might be new to the Battle of Ideas, but I hope that she enjoys it and comes back and becomes a regular. And then third up, we're going to have a regular, who is David Aaronovitch. He's a columnist at The Times. He's worked in print journalism across all the broadsheets, regular contributor to the Jewish Chronicle. He also won the George Orwell Prize for Political Journalism in twice before, 1998, 2001. He's also a broadcaster, and in fact, he started his media career as a TV researcher at Weekend World and On the Record. He's currently working on a series of interviews with Tony Blair to be shown on the BBC, and very importantly, he was a chair of the BBC Radio 4 Moral Maze when Michael Burke was absent, and therefore he was in charge of shouting at me. He's the author of Voodoo Histories, The Role of Conspiracy Theory in Shaping the Modern History, which is an excellent book, which he was signing earlier, and I'd recommend you all read it. Can we just give a very warm welcome to our 3 panellists, please? Brendan O'Neill.
One question we should ask ourselves is whether it's actually possible to have a moral panic at a time when there is no moral consensus. At a time when traditional values are going down the toilet, when traditional morality no longer holds sway, is it possible to have a panic about folk devils who allegedly pose a threat to the moral fabric? I don't think it is, because in order to have a proper moral panic, you need to have some proper morality. You need to have a generally agreed upon set of moral values that people can be accused of transgressing. And we just don't have that today. In our era of moral relativism, it's actually increasingly difficult to have a good old-fashioned moral panic. Now that might sound like good news. No one is really in favour of moral panics. But the tragedy is that moral panics have been replaced by something even worse, by panics underpinned by science rather than by morality. And these new post-moral panics are having a seriously detrimental impact on society. And what we've seen over the past few years is a massive rupture between panic and morality, a massive dissociation of the politics of fear from any system of moral meaning or moral purchase. These days, panics are not motored by moral sensibilities, they're motored by scientific claims or health advice or what are presented to us as objective facts. So consider the panics about young people. You know, in the past, there were moral panics about young people drinking too much, fornicating, and being generally depraved. You know, these randy alcoholic youth were basically accused of sinning against the natural moral order. Today, there are still panics about young people's behavior, but they're presented as health advice. So young people are warned off underage sex and sex outside of a committed relationship through adverts telling them that they will get chlamydia or gonorrhea. They're warned off boozing with graphic photographs of what too much drink might do to their livers. A society that has no clear moral line on sex or marriage or hedonism is forced to fall back on a kind of grisly, bovine form of moral pressure. Incapable of telling young people what is right and what is wrong, our society prefers to spread panic about physical decay and physical ailments. It appeals to us to modify our behavior, not in the name of morality and decency, but in the name of protecting our own livers and genitalia from disease. And often, what we have today is really the rehabilitation of old forms of moral disgust in a new pseudoscientific language. So one of the most unhinged panics of modern times, the panic about the so-called obesity epidemic, is really just the resurrection of the sins of gluttony and sloth. But because society lacks the moral resources to lecture people about being gluttonous and slothful, instead it spreads all sorts of nonsense about body mass index, calorie counting, and so on. And you know, even the moral panic about football hooligans, one of the great mad panics of the 1970s and 80s, has been put through the demoralization process and turned into a kind of pseudo-scientific issue. So recently, Cardiff University published a report arguing that gatherings of 70,000 or more football fans pose a threat to the environment. Apparently, such gatherings leave an eco-footprint 3,000 times the size of the pitch at Wembley. And apparently this kind of eco-unfriendly mass of people leaves behind it 37 tons of glass and 8 tons of paper. And it reveals a lot about the moral disarray of today's cultural elite, that even one of their favourite moral panics, even their disgust with working-class football fans, now has to be swaddled in a kind of neutral academic lingo. And the rise and rise of these post-moral panics has led to some extraordinary double standards in the arena of the politics of fear. Because the new post-moral panic mongers are often the people who are most sniffy about old-fashioned moral panics promoted by the likes of the Daily Mail. So the broadsheet journalists who criticise right-wingers for spreading panic about terrorism are the same ones who will tell you that actually global warming is going to burn us all to death and it's all the fault of unthinking people taking too many cheap flights. You know, the liberal commentators who argue that the working classes are making themselves sick by eating turkey Twizzlers are the same ones who will balk when the Daily Mail says that chavs undermine moral decency. This double standard was really brought home last week after the government published its report on the August riots, revealing that 42% of the rioters had received free school meals. You know, some clever members of the Twitterati started tweeting, "Oh, I bet I know what the Daily Mail's headline will be. It will be free school meals cause riots." But what these twits forgot is that actually that panic has already been done. Over the past few years, respectable publications like the Times Higher Educational Supplement have published so-called expert articles with headlines like "Unhealthy school dinners linked to antisocial behaviour." Today, there is no real constituency for traditionalist moral panics. It's the new post-moral pseudo-scientific panics that make the big impact. And of course, the post-moral panic mongers have developed their own language to try to distinguish themselves from moral panickers. So where they accuse right-wing politicians of playing the fear card, they claim that they are simply trying to raise awareness. They're always trying to raise awareness, whether it's about the imminent collapse of the biosphere or the gastronomical depravity of the working classes, where they accuse old-style moral panickers of using shame and stigma they claim only to be interested in modifying behaviour. And there is one really key difference between the old moral panics and the new post-moral panics. Where the old moral panics were attempts to express and enforce an already existing moral outlook, the new post-moral panics are a substitute for any coherent moral outlook. Today, fear is not used as a complement to morality, but as a stand-in for morality. We have a situation today where society tries to reconstruct something approaching a moral outlook through fear-mongering. And this is quite new, and it gives rise to a situation where basically we have constant panic, one fleeting scare after another, as society tries to magic up some behavioural norms and behavioural barriers in a morally bereft society. And finally, the impact of these post-moral panics on the public is a bit weird. It's a bit confusing. Because on the one hand, precisely because the new fear-mongering is detached from any bigger moral picture, it doesn't have the same purchase that old moral panics had. It doesn't connect with the public in the same way that threats of hell and so on used to. But on the other hand, because there are so many post-moral panics, because it is so constant, there is a cumulative effect. The fleeting scares build on each other to create a kind of sense of unease and dread, often unease and dread about the most mundane things like eating, socializing, and having half a glass of wine. And even the old moral panic merchants of old, they never achieved something as destructive as what we have today, which is a kind of everyday, run-of-the-mill doom.
Thank you, Brendan. Jenny, your thoughts?
I'm very interested to hear Brendan saying that no one's in favour of moral panics, because fundamentally I am. I'm not necessarily in favour of them in the way that they run in the media when they turn into angry, vengeful, vicious, thoughtless attacks on anybody who's seen to do anything wrong. But the fact is that morality really matters, and it matters to all of us, because it's just another name for the social rules by which we live. And the social codes that we hope we live by are those that mean that the people around us can be trusted to behave in ways that don't betray us, that are consistent with the values that they proclaim, and that aren't going to do us down. As Brendan said, God is dead. We've got very little faith in our moral system. We live in a world where there are lots of competing cultures, not only cultures from other societies that have come to live in Britain, but different views about how we ought to live. But that doesn't take us away from our fundamental desire as human beings to have a set of certainties by which we can live. We look for those all the time, because if you haven't got those certainties, if you don't have some rules about how people behave, then you can trust nobody and nothing. And that way, disaster and anarchy lies. So what these moral panics reveal when we find somebody that we can attack, they reveal our need for this deeper moral purpose. When we discover that the rules are being broken and that in some way we're being cheated, we feel threatened. And so we take enormous pleasure in being self-righteous and often acting like a lynch mob. And that's something which has always happened in the entirety of human history. We're very aware of that, from the stocks to literal lynch mobs in America. And nothing makes us also feel as virtuous or as pleasantly united with others as being able to criticize somebody else. Just as in jails, even the murderers and the rapists feel morally superior to the paedophiles, so those of us who do lots of immoral things in our own life, like cheating the parking meters and taking home the stationery and two-timing our partners and paying our builders cash in hand, we can all unite in really loathing those MPs or those hacking journalists. And there's nothing as delightful as that sensation. But the one thing that we don't really address is why these subcultures exist. Because the interesting fact is that if you look at MPs, if you look at bankers, if you look at journalists, they didn't believe they were behaving immorally until they were exposed. They all lived within subcultures where actually what they did was totally approved of. In fact, it was the way to get to the top of the tree. Those hacking journalists weren't hacking because they were breaking the rules of their organization. They were hacking because the people who got the stories were the ones who were praised, promoted, lauded, and kept their jobs. And in an intensely competitive environment, that was what they had to do. And everybody within their organization who was part of that subculture admired them for it. And MPs were basically in exactly the same position, in that they lived in a subculture where they knew that they were being underpaid. They believed very strongly that they hadn't kept pace with people who were of comparable intelligence and of comparable stature, And they knew that Parliament hadn't raised their salaries, and the hidden deal was, you put in X's even for claims that you don't really have to make, and we know that that's making up your salary. So when the MPs were exposed as having fiddled the rest of us, they've all had a deep-seated sense of outrage and grievance, because they think, hang on, we were just playing according to the rules, which was that the little people out there couldn't understand how valuable we really were. Everybody knew we were doing what we were doing, and now we're being punished for it. As one of the MPs, I think it was a Labour MP who went to jail, said, he said, but everybody was doing this, it was just I was the one who got caught. And in a way, he had a point. And the point was, he was in a subculture where you were looked at as an idiot if you didn't claim everything you were entitled to. And bankers live in exactly the same world. Because although they may claim outwardly to be interested in probity and values and social responsibility and all the rest of it, the bankers who win, the bankers who are rewarded, are those who make money. It is the only purpose of being a banker. Money is not a side effect of what they do, as it is in so many other industries. You can, for instance, be Steve Jobs making fantastic computers and you end up a multi-billionaire. The same could be true if you're making television programs or cars or ships. If you're in banking, the only purpose is to be rich. People are only rewarded for being rich. People are only respected if they get to be rich. If you don't take those risks, if you don't take those bonuses, if you don't lie, cheat, steal, insider trade on occasions, then you're an idiot. Because all you're valued for is what you've got. And everybody around you can see that very clearly. Now, the interesting thing is what happens when these subcultures are exposed. Because in two cases, in that of newspapers and that of MPs, the culture has actually changed as a consequence of public exposure. The people within them know that they can't behave as they used to do. So even though they may feel regret, they know that their bosses won't approve them for behaving in this way any longer, and they know that the public is going to expose them for it. So they do actually have a completely different moral culture. There are newspapers now where hacks are saying to me, you know, we can no longer even do the things that we thought we could do in the public interest because everyone is now terrified. The culture has changed. The same is not true at all of bankers. They may feel a little unpopular when they go to dinner parties, and some of them have complained to me about that, but fundamentally they don't give a fuck. Because they're living still in a little subculture where all their children are going to Westminster and Rodin, and they're going to Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge, and they're buying them flats in Notting Hill, and that's what they care about. And they don't give a stuff what the rest of us think. So they're able just to leave our morality entirely on one side, because for them the rewards are still absolutely enormous, and the social rewards that they get from being rich far outweigh the social opprobrium that they might get when they come across an ordinary person who's not within their circle. So the question is, what does one do in a society to change these values? Well, I think the fundamental truth is that our moral panic has allowed us to demonize those three groups at the moment. But in fact, most of us are now operating in a society where being competitive is what counts, and succeeding in a highly competitive world is what counts. And the stated values under which we live are no longer those which pay off. And I was just thinking of a couple of examples, because I think it happens absolutely everywhere. I know somebody who succeeded in getting a chair at Oxford by the simple expedient of lying to them about the fact that he'd been offered 2 excellent jobs elsewhere. He hadn't, but he got the chair. That has made a lifetime difference to his life. I know somebody else, she's a committed Labour voter, she goes on demonstrations, she's all for the rights of the poor, she's very middle class. When she was 23, she got herself an absolutely beautiful garden flat in Hampstead from the council in a Victorian house with a garden. I've said that bit already, because she took along somebody else's pregnancy urine sample and got herself declared a pregnant mother. She never had a baby, but she bought that flat under right to buy. She bought it for 30,000, she sold it for 160. And on the basis of that, she's been able to do almost no work, because her husband works, for the past 15 years, because she's contributed the cost of half the mortgage. The trouble is that we live in a society where very often you can get away with being very competitive and breaking the rules. And there's a simpler example. I know a kid who lives in the Enfield housing estates, who said to me about 5 years ago, and he's 15, he said, the problem with the environment in which I live, he said, most of the people I know are out robbing. They never get caught. Someone like me who doesn't do it just feels like a mug, because I end up with no money. I haven't got the trainers, I haven't got mobile phones, I haven't got the ability to go out on Saturday night like they do, and I don't get the girls. But because no one's going after them, that's what I'm stuck with. And so I think the question is, what are we going to do about this? Because it is possible to change morality, and I think there are 3 really interesting examples from the past 10 years. It's absolutely remarkable how the attitudes to drink driving, to imposing your smoking on others, and to being discriminatory against gay people have changed. That's a combination of legal measures from the government, but also a social need in which these things keep being explained as morally wrong. And I think that perhaps this is where we have to start thinking about how are we going to start reimposing morality, because we can't just pour scorn on moral panics. We have to work out what are the rules by which we're going to live. And I think, for instance, that starts with the debates that are going on in the City of London today and the Occupy London movement. I think we all have to be involved in saying, what do we agree on? How do we wish to be treated by other people? And how are we going to impose those? And that partly consists of punishment, rules and regulations. It partly consists of social pressure. And the social pressure comes partly from the newspapers and partly from people like us. But the one thing we can't do is just dismiss the way morality is operating out in that wild Twitter sphere and everything else, because what it reveals is a deep-seated need for us to be able to say, this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't.
Okay, lots there that we can discuss in a minute, but David, your thoughts?
Yeah, this is actually turning out to be a very wide-ranging discussion.
Indeed.
And I think all the better. I think all the better for it. And you've already heard two, I think, quite different ideas of both, if you like, the quantum of morality and the way in which we discuss morality within society. Can I just, for the moment, stick with the panic element before coming on to the morality element? Because the panic element, in a sense, has altered, it's mutated. My very first journalistic panic that I remember, though I'd already been in the business then for over a decade, was during the 1992 election, when I was working rather ineffectually on the BBC News, making films, and I watched the correspondents going mad about something called the War of Jennifer's Ear, which was an utterly inconsequential dispute about a Labour Party political broadcast and the existence or not of the particular girl who was supposed to have glue ear and whether or not her parents supported the Labour Party. This dominated the election, this issue, for 3 entire days of the election of 1992. And I remember one of the correspondents, I was in charge of the correspondence down at Westminster, theoretically I was, and actually I was in charge of nothing, saying, this may not look like a vital issue, but it is one. And I said no to myself, it doesn't look like a vital issue, and it isn't one. But one of the reasons why that took off in the way it did was it came 2 years after the establishment in Britain and elsewhere, and are noticing it, of 24-hour news. 24-hour news absolutely revolutionized the speed with which certain things happen. And of course, since then, the internet and various forms of social networking and news networking have acted to kind of deepen and accelerate that process. So essentially, that business has changed dramatically, and we now seem to move in a series of cycles whereby, if you like, you can see fairly small blips along your kind of news life cycles, then suddenly confronted by these enormous spikes. Sometimes these spikes have a great relationship to what it is that outside the news cycle and make the news cycle are interested in, and sometimes it has virtually no relationship to what they're interested in, but can actually form part of the background debate. Now, in the immediate recent past, we've had the MP's expenses scandal. We've had phone hacking, the phone hacking scandal, and I would add to this, just because of its topicality, the way in which we've discussed the riots that happened in August. And I want to look at, in a sense, the story that people think that they tell themselves increasingly, and that theoreticians construct around issues such as this. And I think it is like this. Essentially, what we have going on at the moment, and of course it's accentuated by the fact that we are in a period of great economic trouble, is essentially a narrative of decline. It is absolutely everywhere around you, and you hear it absolutely constantly, particularly on something like BBC Radio 4, where I'm not talking about the news people talking about. If you hear an artist or a playwright or almost anybody of the sort of the kind of person who gets, or even sometimes a scientist, interviewed about their views about society, you will hear something very similar to this. That somehow or other, today, we as human beings are less than once we were. We're less good than once we were. We're less authentic than once we were. We are less happy than once we were. We are now very much more likely to be mentally ill than once we were, particularly in Britain and America always being the exemplars of whatever trend it is, and the accelerators of whatever trend it is. We are the first in it, that is what we are. Our children are more narcissistic than ever they were before, and care more about themselves than ever they did. And we even have senior scientists, without any source or evidence, saying things constantly like, the brains of our children are being irretrievably addled and made worse by their use of computers. It is the narrative, the absolute constant narrative of anti-progress, which you hear from almost everywhere around you at the moment. And it is incredibly difficult to say, well, let's stop there for a moment and re-look at these phenomena that you are using to suggest this narrative of decline, our incredible materialism, the way in which we're supposed to care about nothing but shopping, but we don't care about family. Some of your statistics about how we now work harder than we ever did before and see less of our children. Incidentally, a completely false statistic, based entirely on the fact that women now go out to work. It's not based on per person working, it's actually based on working hours per family. And this is somehow supposed to be worse. Let's turn it round on its head a bit and look at the MPs crisis, phone hacking and so on from a rather different perspective. Have MPs been fiddling their expenses, some of them, for a long time? Yes. So what was really different about it? Shall I tell you what was different about it? We found out about it, was what was different about it. How are we at the zenith just before it was discovered of phone hacking? No. The zenith of phone hacking took place something like almost a decade ago. And it was actually stopped and prevented and made illegal by changes in the law that happened as a result of alterations to the way in which we chose to regard the private information. And the fact that we had established powers of monitoring the use of private information. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest to you is the symptoms that we see are not the symptoms of a decline, they're symptoms of our very much better capacity and much greater transparency, our greater capacity to see things. My parents grew up in an age where you wouldn't find out what had happened in Cabinet till 50 years later. There was almost a complete block on instantaneous memoirs. You couldn't have had Hutton, you couldn't have had the Butler Report, you couldn't have had any of these other, you certainly couldn't have had Chilcot, you couldn't have had these major things which effectively told people fairly rapidly what had been going on in society, and phone hacking the same. In other words, the panic in a sense about phone hacking, insofar as it tells you something, doesn't tell you the thing about what a dreadful society we are, but in many ways tells us about what a much more open society we're becoming. Now, I just want to link this to a book that's been published lately, which is Steven Pinker's book on the history of violence. Again, if we have within our mind an image of, if you like, continuous decline, or fairly continuous decline, then a book like this immediately surprises us. Because what it tells us is that far from not sharing moral values, Brendan, the truth is we have universalized moral values far more than we used to, and that things that were broadly acceptable throughout the world only 100 years ago are now much less acceptable. Let me give you a tiny example of this. Our outrage at the way in which Gaddafi's body was treated contrasts with the almost total absence of outrage at the way in which Mussolini's body was treated in 1945. When I made that point, somebody says, yes, but this isn't 1945. And I said, well, does that not suggest to you, at the very least, that if we're talking about a change here, that change has been a positive change? In other words, this is the way we react to sadism, this is the way we increasingly react to casual violence. Not universally, not for everything, but in general terms. What did the riots tell us? A lot of people started saying, of course, the Daily Mail's actual narrative, Brendan, if you remember, was it was foreigners after, that was what they actually chose, that's what they chose to lead on. And so, but what did the riots actually tell us when we examined the statistics? That the people involved were exactly the people that you thought they would be, because they were actually almost exactly the people involved in everything else. That the problem was still pretty much what we thought it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 15 years ago. And so it has been through a series of other kind of panics which created about this same subset of people, knife crime. Whatever happened to gun crime, by the way? Did it suddenly disappear? Were the guns suddenly taken off the street, etc.? Were there suddenly less of them? Maybe there was a successful police operation. You won't hear a discussion of it because, as I said, I think we have got ourselves stuck in this narrative decline. Actually, I even think Brendan got involved in the narrative decline. His last word of his excellent talk was doom. And I always worry when anybody's last word is doom. So my suggestion is that what we talk about when we talk about moral panic is a sequence of events. I mean, actually, events that can be quite positive in a sense. And this is where Jenni's got it right. Hypocrisy, as she very nearly said, is, as was famously said, the tribute that vice pays to virtue. In other words, it knows itself, it knows it transgresses some kind of morality. It was very interesting that we had the discussion yesterday that we began to have nationally when we discovered that CEOs' pay had jumped by 49% in 1 year. Was that popular out there? No, it wasn't. It was extremely unpopular. Would we have noticed it 20 years ago? Probably not. We probably wouldn't have been an issue for significant discussion.
20 years ago, that was what was so interesting.
Well, of course, it was happening 20 years ago. I mean, this isn't...
Not in the same way.
All right, okay.
But anyway, yeah, do come on to it. And actually, when one's interrupted, that's always a good cue to stop, and so I will.
Thank you very much, David. As David noted, all three of you come at this in very, very different ways, so it's quite broad. And I'm not going to overly artificially trying to make you all marry your thoughts, but I'm going to just ask quick whiz along the three of you. Brendan, I thought it was interesting that Jenni's initial response to you was to, forgive me for caricaturing, was to say that actually we do need moral codes, we want them. And I've just actually come from the Battle for Morality strand downstairs, and that was very much, I mean, people were saying that they don't want to live in a morally relativistic society. So how do you respond to what Jenni said? I mean,
Well, I don't think you're going to recreate morality through having panics and through witch hunts. That's the thing. In fact, you'll just make the current moral vacuum worse through that process. But I think Jenni, I mean, I don't go to dinner parties at which there are bankers, unlike Jenni, so I don't really know. I don't really know what they think and how victimized they feel. But I do think Jenni is talking about something slightly different to what I was talking about. I think Jenni's talking about scapegoating, which is a little bit different to moral panics. Because, and it's true, we do live in the era of the scapegoat. You know, people are continually there's a real PC medievalism. You know, the chattering classes love scapegoating and witch hunting at the moment. And they shift frenetically from one to another. So 1 week it's bankers, then it's Rupert Murdoch, then it's Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who's the most evil man in the world, and now we've all forgotten him. Then it's Israel, then it's the Pope. You know, they move around in this crazy fashion. The intensity of their hatred and their scapegoating is only matched by the fleeting nature of it and the speed with which it can disappear. It's a really backward form of politics where you basically project all your hatred and angst onto one goat and then hope to cast him out of the village, literally like they used to do in the old days. It's a highly irrational form of politics, and in fact, it just exacerbates the moral vacuum I'm talking about. But I do think that is slightly different to moral panics. Moral panics is something which impacts much more on the public. I don't think this kind of elite scapegoating has that much impact on the public. I don't think the man in the street particularly hates Rupert Murdoch or Israel. That's just a passion of the chattering class.
Yeah, but I mean, but surely, I mean, the expenses scandal, I mean, these things can take off, though, can't
they can take off, and there is an interplay between these two things. But I also think there is a slight difference between them. There is an interplay of fear and irrationality, but I do think there's a slight difference between the two things. In relation to the riots, and David's point, that it's the same people as ever, and it wasn't that surprising. You know, that might be true, but what was also interesting is that there was very little actual explicit moral condemnation of the rioters. Instead, people preferred to talk about them in neuroscientific terms, the fact that their brains had been messed up because they had bad parenting, or that they were addicted to our hyper culture of consumerism. You know, in fact, people went out of their way to say that the rioters weren't morally responsible for their actions. They were automatons created by our consumer society or by bad parenting and everything else. So the interesting thing about the response to the rioters, I thought, was the way in which people were actually trying to deny their moral responsibility for their actions which I think was actually a really bad thing to do. They are morally responsible for what they did, but society is incapable of holding people morally to account.
Jenny, just in terms of the scapegoating point, because obviously one of the strong points that you made was that these kind of the kind of scandal mongering, or for want of, that's my phrase, obviously, that goes on in terms of like blaming the bankers or blaming the MPs or whatever. That is the way we exhibit our moral outrage, genuine moral outrage. But do you think there's anything in this idea that there's a vacuum and it moves around too much and it's arbitrary? Or you feel
yes,
like...
no, as I said in the first place, it's not that I like the way these moral panics play out. In fact, I've quite often written articles complaining about the way that people who are currently in the public eye are being demonised. I think David Laws, for instance, I felt that he was treated very unjustly. He was clearly a man who wasn't trying to make money that he didn't feel entitled to out of the expensive system. He'd given up an incredibly well-paid city job. He wasn't motivated by cash, and if he'd just said that his partner was actually his partner, he'd have been entitled to every bit of money that he claimed. So it's not that I'm saying that I approve of the way that these play out at all. I think they're frequently vengeful, irrational, unpleasant, and downright misleading. But I'm saying that they perform an important function, and they perform an important function precisely because we aren't very clear about what our morality ought to be. And because we're desperate to find some rules, or only find people that we think we can turn on,
right,
then we'd rather get rid of any complex reasons for why they might have behaved as they did, and we'd just rather jeer at them. And that shows our desperate need for rules. That's really what I'm talking about.
David, just quickly, and then we'll go to the audience. I understand your decline point, but the only thing that I got nervous about was whether you were saying that nothing's changed. Because, I mean, obviously you said News 24, but that's like technical. I mean, there are things that I do think have got worse myself, and I don't want to be able to be in a situation where, because I think something's got worse, you're going to go, oh, she's on a decline thesis. Because otherwise I'm just like paralysed and never be able to comment on anything. Upsetting.
Actually, of course it is much more complicated in a sense of... I mean, one of the functions that firestorms fulfill is that you could argue that they are the sign, and this comes back to both Jenny and Brendan's point actually, they are the sign that we are imposing moral values on a particular situation. In other words, although the symptom, I think that they are actually showing, if you examine it, is not the symptom of decline, they themselves help to make sure, partially, that it isn't a decline, if you see what I mean. In other words, they are part of the business of increasing accountability in a strange way. But the part of the problem with them is that they also overfulfill that function. They can give you a sense of desperation or a sense that nothing is for the better. So somebody like me, will, without wanting to be Panglossian, very, very much wants to redress that imbalance and say, well, hold on a second, turn that one round, because actually you get more truth of it turning it on its head than you will looking at it as presented to you by people who enjoy, and they do, the narrative of decline. People would far rather write about a bad play than about a good play. I mean, that's the kind of critical function. So that's what worries me. And I just want to say one other thing. I don't buy the idea that we are less moral societies. I think actually the discussion of morality is far more constant between individuals and between groups of people than it was when our morality was simply laid down to us by people who called themselves priests. Etc. I think there is far more discussion, with apologies to the priest in the audience, which is still a kind of useful function, but I think there is far more discussion of morality than there used to be when I was a child. It just was laid down when I was a child, and now it's not.
I don't think Jenny's point was answered by Brendan, and I think it's a really important point, that Jenny's all for imposing a morality by someone.
Working a morality out.
I mean, yeah, getting a morality from somewhere, and I think that's what David was sort of talking about there. We used to have it imposed by priests or whomever, and I'd be really interested, particularly from Brendan, to find out, well, yeah, okay, if we don't have a moral code and that's the problem, Jenny's saying let's get one, I don't detect a clear answer as to where we get our moral code from.
Certainly in my experience, certain discussions happen which really draw your attention to the extent to which the vocabulary we use to understand society and discuss things has shifted. So recently I was phenomenally struck by this with the latest round of debate that happened about abortion, driven by Nadine Dorries and her attempts to change the way abortion provision works and introduce a new set of regulations around counselling for women. And I think it's an interesting example in relation to moral concepts, because one of the things about the abortion issue in the way it has in the previous decades been constructed is it's obviously a discussion which has been constructed in very overtly moral terms, and terms which I think potentially have the ability to clarify an awful lot. So it's been a debate between, on the one hand, a moral concern about freedom and individual autonomy, in particular for the pregnant woman, and her right to make choices about her future through expressing her reproductive freedom, a clearly moral concept, set against another moral concept, that's to say the right to life and the value of life of the fetus. And I've always thought that the potential within that debate for clarifying moral questions about what we value and what we think was important is really, really significant. And it was one of the important things about the debate. If you look at what happened now and the utter confusion and evacuation of moral concepts in the discussion that happened around the Nadine Dorries amendment, I think you can just see how far things have shifted, because that debate was marked by the absence of moral vocabulary. Really the only thing that was at the centre of it was just how screwed up do we think women are when they're trying to choose to have an abortion, and how much counselling do they think we need. And as a result, I think that that debate clarified really absolutely nothing about our lives, the wider society. It just really introduced layer upon layer of confusion about pretty much everything.
I was interested in Brendan's point about science, and particularly this issue of the body. And then David's raising the issue of, are we more moral today, and do we have a moral society? And there's two examples that really struck me when I watched these films in terms of how relating to the body, and especially damage and harm to the body, seems to be something that it's almost the only way we can understand ourselves. One was The Passion of the Christ, and the other one I think is called The Hunger, which is about the hunger striker. Passion of the Christ I thought was fascinating, because the key scene where you were meant to really engage with Jesus was when he was being whipped to death virtually in a horrific, almost perverse scene that lasted about 5 minutes. And the whole fetish seemed to be, you know, Mel Gibson's religious, and yet the sort of impact that this film was meant to have on you was through the physical act on Jesus' body, which I thought was very peculiar. And then in The Hunger, which again, decent films, both of them in different ways, but in The Hunger, again, this is a very political film where there's a hunger strike taking place, and the key thing was all about this guy's body depleting. And instead of being if this film was made 20 years ago, it would have been very different, whereas today it seemed to be about the body. And it just seems to me there seems to be a real lack of a capacity to capture our imagination in terms of a more public, moral, or even political framework, rather than just this sense of being damaged as bodies.
I think when we're looking at so-called moral panics, it's very important to set them in their wider context. I think when you understand them as responses to unique events, it's very easy to dismiss them as disproportionate and irrational and histrionic. Whereas often I think these events resonate because they're tapping into concerns that have been present under the surface for quite a long time. So the MP's expenses, for example, came to embody and provided a solid focus for distrust of politicians that have been building up for a very long time. And in that sense, I think moral panics can be functional because they make these latent social concerns explicit and they bring them into the public sphere. And yes, we may disagree with them or they might not be valid, but it's only if they're open that we can actually tackle them.
I'd just like to kind of point out that I think the media's view on morals and the general public and how we deal with morals in our everyday lives are often very, very different things. The media is in its nature very partisan. Depending on which newspaper you choose to read, you will change your view of morality. I'd also say that moral ambiguity is a positive thing. The very fact that we're sat here having this debate can only happen because we have a level of openness and moral ambiguity that allows us to have these discussions. And to elaborate slightly on what David has said, you wouldn't know it to look at the media, but we're living longer, we're healthier than we've ever been before, we're materially richer than we've ever been before, and yet I do totally agree. There's this declinist attitude of things have never been, the good old days, and all, but I think that's part intrinsically of human nature. But I do think that the media plays on panic because it sells, and I do think that we do want scapegoats. Again, I think it's a part of human nature to look for people to blame, but the very fact that things like Hackgate were taken so seriously, I think completely negates the fact that we don't have any morals. I think, if anything, we're living in a more moral time than we've ever lived in before. It's just that there is more allowance and more room for wider morals and more room for differences than we've had previously.
I mean, I could really understand where Brendan was coming from with his discussion about the kind of panics around alcohol and unsafe sex and that type of thing, and we see it a lot. I mean, the discussion around kids' lunchboxes in schools is a great one. The teachers just go in and take the chocolate out. It's a moral panic. Nobody can feed their kids. But this moralism, which seems to come from politicians, was traditionally challenged by a public morality, which was quite separate. So my question really is where the panel think this is today, because it does seem to be missing from the debate.
The thing about the abortion discussion that struck me, I accept your characterisation of the Dorries debate, but if you think there was ever a time in which, if you like, people were very sensible about this issue, that's something like news to me. But it was like the debate about capital punishment. In the end, the side that won it was the side that said there is a concrete right here versus a putative right that is almost impossible to understand, and that is in the end why the 67 Abortion Act and subsequently went through. But this is what has changed. What has changed has been the viability of the fetus at earlier and earlier ages, and that has caused another form of discussion, and that will happen. And that comes back to your point about the body, if you like, and it comes back to Brendan's point also about science and evidence and so on, and the way in which what we learn actually then begins to alter and restructure the discussions we have about morality. I think rather than being afraid of that, we can embrace that, as the woman at the front in the front row very much said. These are signs of progress, I think, on the whole. I don't think they're signs of going backward.
Okay, Jenny?
I absolutely agree with the person over there who said that moral panics take off because they resonate with concerns that people already have, and that's exactly why they're valuable. At the same time, I agree with the person who said that the media's view of what's important may not be what the public think is important, and that's what's so fascinating about the advent of Twitter and Twitter storms and so on, and social networking, that in fact the media is no longer in control of what people think. And if somebody starts a campaign, as they did on Mumsnet, for instance, against the sexualisation of children's behaviour, then that can take off in a way that wasn't possible in the past. But as for this term moral panics, again, which I so object to, the person who made the example of children's lunchboxes being policed, well, all I can say is, up to a certain point, a damn good thing too. I remember a moment when I was talking to a class when my daughter was about 6, and one little deprived, pinch-faced boy's lunchbox fell open. It contained literally a can of Coke, a Kit Kat, and 2 packets of crisps and a chocolate bar. And the idea that this was what this child was being fed, and it was absolutely nobody's business, made me absolutely horrified. You looked at him and you could see what was going to happen to him as a consequence, and indeed it did. On the other hand, the fact that my sister had her daughter's cheese sandwich confiscated at her school last month on the grounds that cheese was too fatty and children shouldn't be eating it, therefore the child had no sandwich at all at lunch, was completely outrageous. So I think that in a way is a kind of metaphor for where we are in morality. You know, we want to make some rules, but they can't be ridiculous. And we have to keep arguing, as the lady in the front said, about what they are. But the one thing we can't do is to say morality doesn't matter.
As we speak, the Are We a Nation of Food Faddists is going on in another room, packed with parents worried about lunchboxes or not. Anyway, yes.
Well, listening to Jenny brings to mind, Trotsky's book, Our Morals and Theirs, and I think, Jenny's quite explicit about the fact that she has moral values which she would like to see imposed on society, and she thinks
I tend to be a dictator.
And other people's moral values don't count for as much. But
actually, Brendan, can I just say, I said we need a discussion about it. I wasn't saying that at all. I was saying we've got to work out what morality is.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Because we need morals.
Kit Kats are immoral. cheese sandwiches are moral. So
Exclusively
we now know
Okay,
we know where
all
we
right.
stand on
Right,
that
right,
burning question
right,
of our
right.
time.
This is a serious discussion, so everybody calm down.
The thing, what we have often today in society is actually an attempt to circumvent moral debate rather than to engage in it. You see that again and again. Society tries to forge a consensus on an issue without actually winning the moral debate about it. You can see that most recently in relation to gay marriage, where anyone who opposes gay marriage is just seen as a Christian lunatic, pretty much. You see it in relation to abortion. You know, the moral argument is not being won on it, and I think it ought to be, because it's a very important issue. But again and again, there are key issues of our time where instead of having a moral debate, you just kind of forge this fairly flimsy consensus, and anyone who dissents is just demonized, just depicted as a denier or a heretic or a fascist or a Christian lunatic. And, you know, David said that, you know, it's great that morality is no longer laid down by priests in the way that it was, but it is laid down, you know, not a substantial morality that actually connects with people, but moralism is still laid down by the upper echelons of society, by GPs, for example, by medical experts, by climate change activists, by scientists. These are the new priests who lay down pseudo-moral strictures for how we should live. You know, and just look at the way in which, you know, Giles Fraser from St. Paul's has now been beatified by The Guardian as the kind of patron saint of the chattering classes because he is this kind of great pontificator against evil bankers. You can see the resurrection of old-style priestly morality in a new kind of flimsy, pseudo-scientific way.
Other than dealing with the minutiae, and it seems that there's lots of that, everyone has their own version of what a moral panic is and what's troubling them and whatever else, it's useful to try and understand in macro what's actually going on here. And in that, a useful model might be that we are, our brains, interacting with society. We shape society, and thereafter, society shapes us. We're involved in a feedback loop with it. The prevailing society that we're in is free market capitalism and democracy. Now, interestingly, free market capitalism, we discovered in 1933 that we cannot sustain its exponential growth or its continued growth, its constant growth, which is what capitalism required. You cannot do that by providing value. You cannot do that by providing moral value, by providing edifying things for people to read or decent, genuinely innovative products for them to buy. So what you have to do to sustain capitalism is make people gullible. You need to rid them of their moral center, the things which basically stop them falling for, there's an expression, any old shit, I think is the expression. So the point here really is that this aligns with the fundament of the workings of the human mind. We have a predisposition to 4 Fs. I'll be quick. Basically, we have fight, flight, feeding, and fornication. And if you look at the media, this is what you're being fed constantly. Why? Because your mind is predisposed to it.
Thank you.
Right. I think David came close to making a good point about the abortion debate, but then at the last minute he got it exactly backwards just now. The pro-choice movement will rue the day it predicated its arguments on fetal viability. Fetal viability is not a moral basis for a defence of abortion. The moral basis for a defence of abortion is that an embryo has a subordinate moral status, regardless of what its viability happens to be, regardless of biomedical considerations. And I think the way you interpreted that point says a lot about the problems of where we are at the moment with this discussion.
I think the wider context of all of this is that we live in a global universe now where, as the gentleman at the back was saying, capitalism is driving us to compete with one another and to forget moral strictures because we're going to be so highly rewarded if we break the rules. And the people who are fiercest in the competition are those who win. Now, there was only a psychological survey out last week which showed that people who are judged in the workplace to be most pleasant and cooperative were also those who earned least. And in fact, people who are untrustworthy and competitive are the ones who are getting ahead. And the only way that we're ever going to make our lives less hypocritical, where we're going to align our stated values alongside those which actually enable us to lead decent lives, are if we decide to structure our society in a way that it's less terrifying to be at the bottom and less hugely rewarded to be at the top. And I've got a friend who grew up as a traditional Tory, and he went to public school and Oxford, and he joined the Foreign Office, and he was really tiresomely conservative until he went and spent 6 years in Scandinavia as a diplomat. He is a total convert to liberal social democracy and to a more equal society. He said it was an absolute revelation to live in a place where people are not terrified all the time about what's going to happen if they don't get their kids into the best schools, if they don't get promotion, if they don't trade up at the right moment, if they lose their jobs. And that is the kind of society, I'm afraid, which enables people to behave in a more moralistic manner. And we are going to be locked into a hypocritical circle.
Thank you very much, Jenny. No, it's all right. We've still got 10 minutes. I've still got time. As Jenny departs, I will just point out that it's also the case that surveys that say those at the bottom are nicer can end up being an apologist for saying, aren't the poor nice? And those who are competitive and want to improve their standards of living might well be being demonised on the way up. I think competition's good myself.
One point was actually addressed to Jenny.
No, well, sorry.
Okay, well, she made the point that these kind of scandals do affect a change in moral culture. And I thought, I can't think of a single example of a public inquiry that has made things better. You think of Colombier, Somme, murder inquiry, even the kind of Alder Hey scandal, those kind of things, which have now produced bureaucracies where there is so little scope for individual judgment and discretion to be made that everybody knows that it's about arse covering. Everybody knows that it doesn't work, and yet the people that have to go through the process of whatever it is, ethical review, as I've experienced it, you go through it knowing you've got to go through this path. The people that are enforcing it don't believe in it either, but they don't feel that they can step outside it. And you do just wish that, for example, with the MPs, some of them have just argued for a pay rise. If we'd started from that starting point, we could have then had a proper discussion. But because they're so defensive and let it roll into a bureaucratic solution, you never get to have an honest discussion, and the consequences of it are actually really, really serious.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes.
Brendan took this point on a bit further, but one of the things that really struck me was, again, when Jenny was talking, it's a shame she's gone, was that the media did actually set themselves up as moral guardians for quite a long time, and the scapegoating that she talked about and the things that were exposed that she talked about and that David's talked about, the media have known about for quite a long time. There's a lot of things that the media know about that they didn't actually allow to become public, and it seems to me that what happened at one level is that there was a breakdown, maybe a loss of courage amongst the media to be the moral guardians of society. I mean, somebody at the front said that there's great moral ambiguity in society at the moment. Well, I disagree. I mean, I live in the country outside of London, and friends of mine have been disgusted that I even want to talk about the Bolger case when it came up in the news, that I would even have any kind of element of sympathy of one of the characters that was out of prison, and maybe he could live a good life after what had happened. And there really isn't that moral ambiguity. There really are things that you're not allowed to say in society at the moment. And that was created by the media, and the media did set themselves up as the moral guardian. They're now too scared to do that. I'm not sure that the people that Brendan is talking about are taking on that role in the same way that the politicians did in the past through the moral panics, or that the media did in the past through the creation of the moral panics that the media created. And I think that is actually the problem. That is where the moral vacuum is that nobody is prepared to take up that mantle.
I'm actually with David Aaronovitch on this, that life is generally getting more moral. And my real problem is I do not recognise your discussion of moral debate, because you seem to be talking about people sitting down and having a discussion. But moral debate takes place in terms of the actions we take as well. And one of the things you raised was the issue of gay marriage. Well, that whole debate opened thanks to Clause 28, because people started coming out, and the debate took place over, are you going to kick your kid out of the house and lose your kid, or are you going to realise that actually it's not a problem? One of the biggest things that happened in my life was Rabbi Blue coming out, at which point my grandmother, about the next day, phoned me up and said, maybe we should talk about why you don't come to visit anymore. And I was able to talk to my grandmother, and I watched the moral debate over gay marriage shifting, not because people were having a discussion, although that was happening too, but because people realised they weren't talking about weirdos over there. They were talking about the brother they liked, the teacher they adored. All of those people around them suddenly became real. And very often when moral shifts take place, it's because we recognise the other as real.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I've got two questions for the panel. First of all, which has actually been touched on the last few points made. Do you believe that the state has a moral role? I think there's probably a fine line between the nanny state and enforcing morality. But do you think that the state should be out there, repealing Clause 28, 28, does it have a role to get involved in community and society and decide what is the moral thing to do? Not because, as we've talked, because there's a legal point of it, but because they believe it's morally right. Should the state get involved in that or not? My second question is, David mentioned earlier that that God is dead and presented that as a truism, and I think that's true in our country, but I think that's not true in other countries. I'm thinking here of the growth of Islam in North Africa, the strengthening of evangelical Christianity in North America. I'm thinking about Catholicism in South America. I mean, what does the panel think about it seems to me, the growth and the strengthening of religion, all religions, and also things like Scientology and other religions? Is that because there is a moral vacuum and people look to the church more? And if so, why has that not happened in our country?
What's wrong with morality being imposed? If it is moral and you actually believe in it, then don't you actually want people to abide by it, and you won't tolerate those who go outside it? I think there was a lot of talk about school lunches a moment ago, but anyone who's actually worked in a school will know that the children need that sort of, if you like, moral code which is enforced. You have that, you have that zero tolerance of sort of racist bullying, racist name-calling. That is imposing your morality, but it seems to me to be absolutely right. So I don't see that there's a problem, and I rather resent the sort of language which is used about imposing morality. If morality is moral, and if it is true, then it's not a question of imposing, it's a question of bringing it out and living by it.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Brendan, just give us how you want to leave this discussion, what you want people to think about, because there's no sort of right or wrong.
Well, it's interesting that someone raised Clause 28, because I think Clause 28, the whole discussion around that, is a really important turning point in relation to all this discussion. But maybe we disagree on how it's an important turning point, because I think what the Clause 28 discussion in the 80s really revealed was the end of the old moral order, really showed the corrosion of traditionalism, attachment to marriage, attachment to same-sex relationships, all that stuff kind of fizzles away, and something new comes in its place. But and then you have kind of John Major desperately trying to hold on to traditional values with his back to basics stuff in the early 90s, and it just falls completely flat on its face, and it has no impact on the public whatsoever. But I think what's happened is that the old morality has fallen away, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there is a new moralism taking its place, and you can see this in relation to the debate about gay marriage and homosexuals and homophobia. Homophobics, as they're called, are now treated in the same way that homosexuals once were, as being mentally disordered, right, okay, well, who knows? They're treated as being mentally disordered, as beyond the pale, as people who have no place in society. So there has been a shift, and you see that terminology used again and again in relation to people who say unacceptable things these days. They're now described as phobic, Islamophobic, homophobic. Basically it's an irrational disorder. How can you think like this? Who are you? So there have been improvements, but there has also been a shift in the moralism, and the targets are different. That's really what's happened, which is not necessarily a positive development in my view. In relation to morality being imposed, firstly, I think the state has no role in morality at all. The state should get out of the whole discussion about morality. I'm in favour of a human-centred morality, which means it should be something that comes from open democratic debate with the public. I know people have this kind of allergy to involving, Joe Public in debates about morality, but that's actually what should be done. And, I just don't think it's reasonable to impose morality. If you read John Stuart Mill on liberty, he makes the point that you can only actually become a properly morally responsible adult through having free choice, through exercising your moral and mental faculties, through making the choices about your life, because it's only through choosing your way in life with your neighbours and your friends that you actually become responsible for your actions. You can only be morally responsible by being free and having freedom of choice. So the idea of imposing morality, in my view, is a contradiction in terms. Morality is something which springs from people's lived experiences, which they forge themselves. And unfortunately, what we have today, through the new post-moral panics and pseudo-scientific scares, is a kind of post-Clause 28 attempt to impose a new form of moralism, which is no more progressive and in some ways is worse than the moralism that prevailed before the Clause 28 discussion.
David, your final thoughts?
The first thing is to the chap who had the 4 Fs. I'm afraid I simply don't believe that we know enough about the brain to accept that kind of evolutionary determinism. as far as I can see by perception and so on, one of the things about human beings is that their socialization and their social capacities mean that they are far more plastic than you seem to suggest. And actually, I discovered that large parts of my life are devoted to none of those four things: not flying, not fighting, not fornicating, and not feeding. Witness now. I don't think I'm even fighting now. So I don't accept that. But I thought there were some very, very interesting points. I really wanted to take up the challenge of let's find an inquiry which had a positive result. And it took me back, partially also because the Jamie Bulger case was mentioned. And also it just took me back to the other moral panic which we could have mentioned. Maybe it was worst of all, which was the Baby P case. The problem is that we get ourselves into a form of discussion, and we can say it resonates, and of course it does resonate. The immediate impact is, how could such a thing be allowed to happen? This is then shorn of context. It's shorn of the context of how have these things happened in the past? Is there more of them than there used to be? Where are we being successful in dealing with this? Where are we not being successful? What is it reasonable for us to expect from social workers and not reasonable for us to expect? And it becomes subsumed in a notion, who is to blame and can we run them out of town? It's like something out of the Wild West. You know, we get Sharon Shoesmith, we stick her back to front on a mule and we slap its behind and say, we don't want to see your ass again. And so on. Is that really a valuable way of dealing with things? And the Bulger case raised it again as well. And I've written about this. So some of us in the media do try, but I do kind of take your point, which was one of the things that we discovered was the way in which Norway had handled their same equivalent of the Bulger case by social consensus. The child who was involved was never named. It never became an issue in Norway what became of this child as an adult. The idea of being punitive about what they'd done was not a big issue in Norwegian society, including not the parents of the child who was murdered. It was an utterly different way of looking. Of course, there are better and worse ways of doing things, and I certainly sat at that stage and thought, if only we could have the kind of discussion that you would have in Norway. It brings us incidentally to another point, which is also countries have their own cultural differences, because I thought that when talking about the British middle class. Finally, I think one of the things that we have been doing as a species is widening the circle of empathy wider and wider as we know more about other human beings and so on. It's one of the reasons why I obviously misspoke myself when it came to abortion, because I absolutely see that the pro-abortion or pro-choice argument has a problem when it starts to argue about the capacity of fetuses to survive. It is a problem because it starts to dilute the principle of the right to choose. But the problem that you have is, if you're widening the circle of empathy, what you'll discover is people widening the empathy to what they've discovered about the viability of fetuses at an early age. And you're going to have, somehow or other, now in the end, I'm going to come back down to principle, but I'm going to have to bear in mind that the fact that there have been these scientific changes places the argument in a kind of slightly different context and take account of that. Finally, on the imposition of morality. Well, of course the state imposes morality because the state polices laws. It polices laws partially through a discretionary basis, and therefore it's always in the business of imposing a morality which hopefully the society has in some sense agreed to. And although Mill is not a bad quotation, I don't want anybody to discover murder is wrong through their own personal experience. In other words, there are some things which you tell your children, most of us do, at the beginning about such things as theft, about such things as how they treat other people and so on, which might not be, I don't know what we mean by imposed, but they are certainly values which are suggested by one person in authority to somebody who's not, and that will continue, and I think that has to continue. Then it's free for people to begin to argue about whether or not those values are the right one, but I think that that is an absolutely eternal and inevitable process.
Okay, can we thank both our speakers and Jenni?